welcome to part 2 of the Python programming for beginners. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and show you a few of the very fundamentals of coding with Python. So I'm going to show you the different data types, the different placeholders you can have, such as like lists, dictionaries. But first I'm going to show you the types of values you can have. So one thing I want to go over really quick is, so in Python you can have something, since it is object oriented, you can set things equal to other things and refer to them over and over again. So every time you want to refer to it, you don't have to create it over and over again. You just have to call whatever you named it. So if you watched part 1 of the tutorial, I kind of had the theory that Python is very similar to like if you're creating your own tools and then using them later, and that's kind of how Python works. So when you make a variable, you set whatever you name this variable equal to something, and then you can use it again. So this is really arbitrary. You can use anything, you can name it anything, as long as it's not already something that's built into Python. For example, if you try to use print and assign that to something, you wouldn't be able to do that because it's already a preset defined function inside of Python. So good thing Python, and Spider specifically, has this color coding, so you know when it's a pre-built function and you don't have to use it or write over it. You can simply change it to something like print1, and then all of a sudden you can use it. Of course, you want to use your names according to whatever you're trying to do, so it's easy to remember and you can refer to them easier. But as long as it's not already taken by Python, technically you can assign it. Now there are certain things that are just standard in Python. So for example, you can see my variable here. The first letter is capitalized as well as the second of every word. There's also something called, I believe this one's camel case. There's also something called snake case where you would do something like this and you can make it do the same thing. But as long as you're consistent with these naming conventions, you should be fine. Usually it just depends on personal preference on which one's easier to read. Some people are used to this, some people are used to this. I really don't mind as long as I stay consistent throughout the two. Those are the last things on my mind, but as long as you're consistent and you're comfortable with something, this kind of looks more codey. This one kind of looks more, I guess, like code as opposed to this one. This just looks like it has no spaces. So a lot of people do pick snake case, and regardless, they're both interchangeable as long as you're consistent throughout your entire program. But as you can see, I am assigning it this variable to something. So right now, this is an empty string. So there's nothing inside of the string. If I put something inside, now there's a space. So anytime I try to use this, it'll show this space. So I'm going to show you something really quick. So for example, I use my variable and I assign it. So if I were to run this, nothing technically happens. There's no output. It's saved in memory, but nothing happens. If I were to go and print my variable, then we would get a space back. You can't see it because it is a space, but if I were to put 1 in here, you can see it returns 1. And now this kind of introduces into the different types. So you can see this is a 1, and to the eye this looks like a number, but if you look up here, it's actually a string. So you could view a string as a sentence in a sort of where if you're using the number 1 in a sentence, you're referring to it as a part of the sentence. You're not necessarily referring it to as an integer directly, where you would do math with, or any kind of like multiplication or anything like that. That would look like this. So here it looks exactly the same, but there's something called the data type in Python where it does matter, because if you try to multiply a string of 1 by something, you wouldn't get the same output as if you were to multiply a digit by something. So for example, 1 times 5 here, you can use it like a calculator to get back 5. But if I were to surround this in quotes, you would get 5 ones. So that's kind of how that works, where the data type does matter, and you can't just name it however you want. You have to know exactly what you're referring to it as. And notice how it keeps that calculation stored in memory. We're not necessarily just running this calculation. We're actually storing it in memory and then printing this variable. And this variable points at this, and it prints the output of that. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully I'm not going too fast, but I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to this. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and return this to an empty string now. But yeah, I just wanted to show you that you can look at this as a container, and what it contains is on the right side. So whatever you name it, that's what your variable is going to be called. Anything on the right is what's inside of that, and you can refer to it over and over again. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I am going to introduce you to a list. So as you saw, you can assign one thing into a variable, but if you wanted to assign multiple things into a variable, you would want to use something called a list. So lists are great because you could have like a list of something. So if you have like a list of groceries or a list on a receipt, you can index the list by looking at what there is. They're not separate receipts. So that's why lists are great, it's because it puts it all together and then you can index them. Index meaning go through the list and look for what you want. And that's one other way of holding it inside of the container. So there's other kinds as well, but for now I'm just going to introduce you to the list for the purposes of this demonstration. So as I mentioned earlier, it's important what kind of data type you're referring to. So I called this one my int, or my integers, and this is the data type integers. As you can see in this specific spider version, it's yellow. So you could have 4, you can have 400, you can have 4,000, and they're separated by a comma. So if I were to print my list, sorry, it's actually called my int. You can see it comes back 4, 400, 4,000. So let's say this was a list of a receipt prices or something. You could actually index it by whichever one you want to go to. And something interesting about Python is normally this would be the first place, second place, and third place in the list. But in Python, you actually start at 0. So this is technically the 0th place, first place, and the second place. So you still get 1, 2, 3, but you're just starting from 0. So this is the first or 0th place, so you would put 0 here. And if you wanted to simply get 4, you could actually get 4 by putting 0 and indexing it. If you wanted to get the second place, you could put 1. And if you wanted to get the third place, you can press 2. And if, of course, you wanted to get the whole thing, you can do that as well. Now, if you wanted to go and get the last one, another way you can do it, just for future reference or just so you know, you can also reverse index. So by putting -1, it doesn't break Python or anything. It actually starts from the back and goes backwards. So you should get 4,000 here. And yeah, so that's just a list of integers. Of course, if you put these parentheses around them, that would change it into a string, and you wouldn't be able to do multiplication with them, but you'd be able to put them in sentences just the same. Yeah, so that's one kind of data type. You have integers. Another kind is called floats. So floats are pretty much just decimals. So you have 4.5, 14.5, and 14.9, just for the simplicity of showing you. And you could do the same thing with this because they're both in lists. You could index them, you could print single ones, but the main thing I want to show you is that you can store them in the different kinds. Alright, so now we're getting to strings. So my string, so with strings you have to wrap them in text like this. Anything that goes inside of there is inside of the string. You can also do the double quotes, and it works the exact same way. This kind of goes for snake case and camel case. Python doesn't care which one you use, but you do want to make sure that you are consistent with it and you're not putting double quotes at one place and single quotes in another, just for coding purposes. But also, I kind of prefer double quotes. Of course, you always see me switching through, but I try to stay consistent with whichever one I use. Usually I think I do go single quotes, but a point where double quotes might matter is if inside of a sentence there's already a quote. So it might get confused, and double quotes will eliminate that, and we'll see it all as a string. So just for demonstration purposes, I can show you. So this is our print statement, of course. Anything we wrap around inside of these brackets, anything we put inside of these is going to come out and print. So if I had, just for simplicities, okay, so if I put that, we should get hello back. Now, let's say this was a quote. I could put double quotes around it, and it would see anything inside of the double quotes as a string, so you'd actually get hello back. So that's one of the few cases where you wouldn't want to get confused. So you'd use double brackets, unless you just prefer to use double brackets along the entire way. But that's just an example. All right, so the list can hold different types of values. So we have a string here. Of course, we have a number, but it's wrapped around in the parentheses. So it's technically a string. And if you were to multiply this by a number, you'd get however many of that number times this. In terms of how many times it's printed, not actual math like calculations. And we even have a float here, but it's in a string, so it's of course still like a sentence if you're using it in a sentence, and another integer here, but it's a string because it's wrapped around. And of course there's the double the double parentheses. Alright, so then types in a list, you can have actually multiple types. You can have a string, you can have an integer, and you can have a float, and Python does not care. So you could actually index them, and it doesn't interfere in any way. You don't have to make a separate list by any means. You can have them all in the same kind and have different data types. That's it for this tutorial. I just wanted to introduce you into what printing does. It returns the output here. If you saw the first video, I do recommend getting familiar with a spider and like how you can code here. This is a variable explorer and it shows you everything, so it's actually kind of cool too. So if you see my int, just to make sure it ran right, you can actually look for what's inside of it to make sure everything went through. So this is important when you start making these through other means instead of just printing them here or specifically adding them here. There's other ways you can add to a list, and that's where you want to make sure everything went through correctly, but that's a little bit further in the course. Just be looking forward to those videos because I'm going to try to put one out every weekday, and on the weekends I might not put any out, put different content, but on the weekdays I'm going to try to put one of these out every day, just to kind of refresh and also put some more information out there. I know my channel is more of a personal development channel, but this is something I do, and I know a lot of times with personal development it could seem so non-physical, if that makes sense. Like, they can give you a bunch of advice, but there's nothing you could exactly apply it to sometimes. And of course sometimes you can put it towards your own goals or business or whatever kind of career you're trying to develop, but some people don't have an actual goal or direction that they're interested in yet, so this is just one option to maybe learn and potentially apply the personal development to, in case you haven't already found something. But if you have found something, like whatever it may be, I think that's amazing too. Definitely go for that. But this is what I'm familiar with, so and I like to apply the personal development to this as far as like growing or how I see things and approach things. So it's the way I know how to apply it. So maybe you could learn a new skill or just see how I apply it, or to potentially just have an option in case you haven't already found something that you like. So I never really liked when personal development would kind of just give a bunch of like general advice, but then you almost kind of are left hanging. So this is just something that, in case you feel that way, you can always hop on and try to learn as well. So alright, part 3 is going to be coming up next, and thanks.